Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're taking a look at all the new cards coming out in the Forgotten Treasures expansion, coming out on April 5th. We have 2 new cards per faction, plus a bunch of neutrals. I'll give you my thoughts on how to use all the cards, and whether they're absolutely amazing or complete and utter garbage. And if you're wondering, why should I listen to you, Lids? The answer is first, you shouldn't. But second, that here we play a lot of experimental decks. So I know a thing or two about combining cards in new and creative ways. Also, I have not yet seen anyone else's explanation of these cards, so you'll be getting my personal independent opinion on all of them, in case you're looking for another perspective. So let's go give them a look. For Northern Realms, we have the Traveling Priestess, who is a human cleric who has VIAL, and on deploy will gain charges. Each of those charges will boost an allied unit by 1, and whenever we put her back into our deck, we will increase the number of charges that she gains by 3. That means that rather than playing her directly from our hand as soon as we see her, we want to try to mulligan her back into our deck as many times as possible to increase those number of charges, and therefore increase the number of points. Because if you don't do that, 3 points for 4 provisions is bad value. So I see 2 ways of playing this card, either a low risk, low reward way, or a high risk, high reward way. The low risk way is to throw one into your deck, mulligan it in round 1 or round 2 if you see it, and that way, if it does get back into your hand by round 3, it's at least playable. And worst comes to worst, if it shows up for the first time in round 3, it's a single 4 provision cost card that, like almost any other 4 provision cost card, you'd rather just mulligan and never play at all. But the high risk, high reward option would be to build an entire deck around this using cards like Istrid, Griffin Witcher Mentors, Centurion Envoys, and all those cards that help you draw cards and put cards back into your deck. That way, when you combine that with, ideally, having this card in your hand at the start of a round and mulliganing it out, you could get a ton of charges on this and give you a ton of boosts. And because it has Zeal, you can use it as a big finisher or high tempo play, kind of like Alumni. I'm not sure if those other cards are strong enough to justify going that route just to play around this one unit, but maybe a middle ground would be if you're playing a pincer maneuver deck, you might as well throw one of these in as one of your 4 provision filler cards, and whenever you're trying to get one of your key cards with pincer maneuver, you might as well swap this out, and if you do get it back in round 3, then you get some additional value. The other card we're getting for Northern Realms is the MUTAGENERATOR, which is an artifact, and whenever we play a unit in the melee row, we will boost 5 random units that have the same amount of provisions on our side of the board by 1 point, or whenever we play a unit in the range row, we will boost 5 random units in our deck with the same provision cost by 1. So once again, I think there are 2 key ways to play this. One way is to load up on a bunch of bronze units that you want to boost in the melee row with things like Trident Infantry, Lyrian Scythemen, Temerian Infantry, Full Test plus a Dun Banner or Blue Stripes Commando, and Cohen. Because a lot of those units cost the same amount of provisions, you can get a lot of them on the board, and they all benefit from getting boosted. The other way is if you go in the range row, you might be able to help set up some deck boosts for Erland and Archgriffin. That being said, the melee row seems a little bit easier to set up for me since there are just more units that have 4 or 5 provisions, whereas once you get up to the 9 for Archgriffin, that gets a little bit trickier. Granted, I suppose for Erland, you don't need to boost him directly, as much as you just play a unit in the range row that has a bunch of other units with the same amount of provision costs in your deck, so that when you do play Erland, you absorb all of those boosts. For Syndicate, we have the Shady Vendor, which is a human blind eye with 4 power, 2 profit, and costs 5 provisions. And it's somewhat rare in that it has a fairly significant tribute ability, which you tend not to see for bronze units. So if we use that tribute in the melee row, we can spend 4 coins to play a 4 provision cost crime, or if we go in the range row, we can spend 5 coins to get a 5 provision cost crime. So it seems like a really solid low provision cost spender in crime decks, as long as you have a lot of coins to support it. It does probably fit in quite well with the King of Beggars deck, especially if you miss out on some of your big spenders and you're concerned about not even getting King of Beggars out from your deck at all. And off the books can also make those tributes cost 1 coin less. Then for Syndicate, we also have the Conjurer's Candle, which is a 6 provision artifact, and it has resilience, so it will carry over from 1 round into the next, and profit 5, so it gives you some coins, but the biggest thing that this does is it gives you, potentially, a very strong spender, making this almost like the opposite of King of Beggars. Because first you spend 1 coin to boost an allied unit by 1, then once you've done that, you can spend 2 coins to boost an allied unit by 2, and so on and so forth until eventually you could get up to even 9. So what that means is you're going to want to play this early, generate a lot of coins so you can use this ability several times, to the point where you're capable of getting some big boost from it, then carry it over into the next round with resilience, drop a huge coin slam like, say, Siggy, then with all those coins that you just got, give Siggy a huge boost from the Conjurer's Candle, and either tempo pass or push with those huge point slams in a really short round, especially if you're running Jackpot, because then you can also use your leader ability to do even more Conjurer's Candle boosting, giving you just an absurd amount of points in just one turn. For monsters, we have the Giant Toad, which is a 3-power, 5-provision cost beast, which consumes a unit on deploy, but if I'm interpreting this correctly, then once this card is in your graveyard, say in a later round, once you play a Death Wish unit, Giant Toad will get summoned from your graveyard, consume that Death Wish unit, and then the Giant Toad gains Doomed. If that is how this card works, then Giant Toad has Vi written all over it, giving you another way to consume Vi twice for just 5 provisions. And unlike Slizzard or Baba Yazi, doesn't have to sit there on the board vulnerable waiting for you to play Vi on your next turn before it can consume. And obviously it would work well with other Death Wish units like Ruin, Imperial Manticore, Arrakis Queen, Rot Fiend, and Succubus as well. Then Monsters also has the Necromancer's Tome, which is an 8-provision cost artifact, and whenever you play a bronze unit, you will summon a random copy of it from your graveyard onto the same row and give that card Doomed. This card is fairly expensive, but I think it does have a lot of potential, if you make a point of playing one copy of some of your strongest bronze units in an early round, and save other copies of those cards in your deck. I'm thinking of your usual Mamuna targets like the Griffin, and Gonsian, or however you pronounce that card. For Nilfgaard, we have the Obsidian Mirror, which is a 4-provision cost tactic, which regardless of whatever this card does, is a huge deal for both Enslave and Jan, because it gives a much easier way to power up the Enslave leader ability, and more options to more reliably get Jan into your starting hand. At worst, it's just 3 points for 4 provisions, which is bad value. But there are definitely some creative uses for this card. The first thing that comes to mind is using an operator to put a card on your opponent's side of the board that you want because it synergizes with your deck, then use Obsidian Mirror to get 3 more copies of it. And assuming that unit helps you out in some other way, then presumably it's going to give you more than 3 points of value. You could even use teleportation to replay 1 or 2 of those cards that you spawn on your side to get them back up to their starting power. So although on the surface level this card may look like complete trash, its provision cost and tag alone makes it very useful, and there are definitely still some galaxy brain plays to be made with this, and the only limitation is your imagination. Then we have the Prophet, which is a human cultist with 8 power that costs 7 provisions. On deploy, it will damage self by 2, then lock all units in your opponent's hand until the end of the round. The next time your opponent plays a locked unit, it will remove all locks from your opponent's hand, or if you wait until the end of the round at Adrenaline 2, then it'll just lock itself. So basically what this does is it guarantees that you will lock one of your opponent's units. The difference between lock from the Prophet and lock from any other card is that because the Prophet proactively locks cards before they get played, that prevents your opponent from playing any unit's deploy abilities, which is much stronger than a normal lock. But then once your opponent plays one of those units, all of their remaining cards will get unlocked and will be back to normal. However, if you really want to go big brain here, if you can find a way to lock the Prophet on the same turn that you play it, I am really curious to see if you can permanently lock every card in your opponent's hand, in which case you probably just won the game. That's actually surprisingly very difficult to do, even for Nilfgaard, but if you can find a way to pull that off, then you might be getting yourself guaranteed wins. For Skellige, we have the Highland Warlord, which is a 3 power, 1 armor, 5 provision cost human warrior. It has Veteran, so its base power will increase by 1 every round, and then on deploy, it will increase the damage of all of our raid cards by 1 for the rest of the game. And this card is very unique. Don't let that Veteran distract you too much, because this is all about the raid synergies. That means you probably want to play this card as early as possible to increase the removal power of your Gutting Slash, Stunning Blow, and or Blood Eagle. After playing a Warlord or 2, even those bronze raid cards will still be able to remove tons of units. Now, is that reason enough for raids to creep into the meta? That's hard to say because there aren't really decks that are going all in on raids these days. But if you really want, you could even replay these guys with teleportation in round 1 and make raids able to remove almost anything for the rest of the game. That still sounds like a relatively weak round 1, but it gives you a new kind of carryover value, so I'm curious to see how impactful that might be, and maybe it is worth it, and maybe it isn't. And the Veteran is pretty much just there to give you a little compensation in case you've already played all your raids in round 1 and you only end up getting the Warlord in round 3. Then Skellige also gets the Magic Compass, which is an 8 provision cost special card with Echo, so after we play it the first time, we'll get another copy of it at the start of the next round. It has us look at the top 3 cards in our deck, and then play one of them and move the other 2 cards to our graveyard. If there are fewer than 3 cards in our deck, it will spawn and play a legendary Skellige card that was not in our starting deck. So this is a bit of a different kind of tutor. It's kind of like a Skellige War Council, with a pretty significant catch that looks like it's bad, but can in some circumstances actually be good. Because by discarding 2 of your weaker cards, you can thin out your deck somewhat significantly, though you also run the risk of potentially needing to discard one of your stronger cards. That being said, Skellige is the best faction at playing cards from your graveyard, so that may not be as much of an issue if you can play a unit from your graveyard with Sigdriff's Right, Fukusia, Renew, and or Freya's Blessing. Or maybe even a big alchemy card with Bride of the Sea. And if you're really ambitious, you might even be able to put this into a Lippy deck, because that way, even if you do discard your good cards, you can still get them back into your deck with Lippy. And because this card has Echo, that means if you combine it with other tutors, the Skellige Discard Package, Dimmin Pirates, and or Ryogon, then it's possible to use this in a Skellige Hyperthin deck. That would require using a lot of high provision cost cards, so you may need to leave out a big card or 2, which would be a downside, but then again, that's where playing the legendary Skellige card that wasn't in your starting deck may make up for that deficiency. It's gonna be really hard to tell how strong that would be, but that does sound really interesting, so I'm certainly at least interested to try it. For Scoia'tael, we have the GIANTSLAYER, which is a 4 power, 6 provision cost dwarf, who on deploy will choose an enemy unit, and if that unit's base power is higher than the GIANTSLAYER's, the GIANTSLAYER will gain 3 armor. Then, as long as the GIANTSLAYER has armor, it will damage that unit by 1 at the end of your turn. But the big thing is that once that unit gets destroyed, the GIANTSLAYER will gain resilience, giving you carryover. So there are actually a ton of dwarf buffs in this upcoming patch, so there will likely be a lot of people playing dwarves. But the question is, will this card fit into those decks, or will it get dropped in favor of some of the other recently buffed cards by the end of the week? This card reminds me a lot of Northern Realms' Meditating Mage, because that's the only other bronze unit that can also get resilience, and in the Mage's case, it has 1 boost per turn, and resilience when you have another mage on the board, whereas in this case, you're getting 1 damage per turn, and resilience after you destroy a unit. The armor on the GIANTSLAYER probably makes it more likely to survive long enough to carry over into the next round compared to the Meditating Mage, but is that reason enough for it to cost 2 more provisions than a Meditating Mage? Mahakam Forge and other dwarves can give it more armor, but dwarves don't have many forms of targeted damage to facilitate taking out that selected unit, so it may be a little tricky at times to meet that resilience condition. But if GIANTSLAYER does carry over, then it does give you a head start on a lot of dwarf synergies in the next round, since dwarves are all about gaining power for every dwarf that you control. So overall, there's definitely some solid potential, but at 6 provisions, it may be too expensive to justify using the GIANTSLAYER, especially given all the other dwarf buffs that we're about to get. Then Scoia'tael is also getting the PRISM pendant, which is a 6 provision cost artifact, and fun fact, this is basically the old Momentum seasonal event put into artifact form, because whenever you target an allied unit with a special, you'll give it vitality equal to that special's provision cost. Then whenever you damage an enemy with a special card, you will give it bleeding equal to that special card's provision cost. So this card does have potential for a lot of value, but the key issue with bleed and vitality, as always, will be tempo. 1 point per turn is not very strong, even if you do have that bleed or vitality going for a long duration. That means the best way to play this card will probably be with lots of little damage or boosting specials, so that you get multiple bleed and or vitality procs per turn, rather than just 1 proc from a single big damage or big boost special. With that in mind, I think there are 2 ways to play this card. One would be in the Elven Deadeye Overload decks that have become quite popular recently, with things like Vanadane, Francesca, and or Simlas to give you tons of waylays to damage as many opposing units as possible to get as many bleed procs per turn as possible. The other way would be to focus on boosting your own units and getting vitality in the process, using sorceresses of Dolblathana, Elven Seers, Francesca, maybe Salve, and Simlas to get as many Orbs of Insight as you can, and spread those boosts across as many of your units as possible to maximize the number of vitality procs per turn. I'm not as big a fan of that method because Orb of Insight already gives you vitality, so you may not have enough time for all the additional vitality from Prism Pendant to proc. But if you use this card with one of those decks, and you're able to pull off some of those combos for lots of special cards, then I think you can make it work well. Otherwise, it may not have enough pacing to be meaningful. For neutrals, we have VIAL Forbidden Knowledge, which is a 4 provision cost artifact. It has Zeal and the order to give an allied unit a boost of 4 and vitality 4. So that's 8 points with 4 provisions, with not the best pacing, but still very solid value, to the point where I could almost see this being an auto-include in any non-devotion deck. However, if that is the case, then you're very likely to proc that secondary ability where, if both players have this card in their deck, it will automatically start on the board for both players and transform, into VIAL Forbidden Knowledge Unsealed, in which case, rather than giving you boosts, both you and your opponent will be able to look at the other player's entire deck, which is a very interesting consequence, because depending on what deck you're running, it could be a big factor if suddenly your opponent knows all the big cards that you're planning to play. Or maybe if you're a control deck, you actually want that to happen so that you know when and where you should use your best control cards. Then we have Troll Porter, which is a 6 power, 6 provision cost Ogroid unit, which when played in the melee row will banish all cards in your hand, then draw as many cards as you banished, which may look like a meme at first. However, this may actually be OP. Sure, I guess you could use it if you happen to brick your entire hand. However, the best way to play this is probably if you're using a Nilfgaard Kolgrim deck, because if you load up on some tactics, making sure that you get Yawn in your starting hand, you start by playing Yawn, so that you stack your deck with all of your best cards at the top, then play Troll Porter to banish all the junk 4 and 5 provision cost tactics that you had in your starting hand, guarantee that you draw into all of your best cards, play all your high provision powerful tactics and non-Kolgrim cards for the remainder of round 1, and go as many cards down as you need to win round 1. Then in round 2, you play Kolgrim, and because Troll Porter thinned out 7 or 8 cards from your deck, you just made Kolgrim way stronger than he would have otherwise been. Then there's the Ornate CENSER, which is an 8 provision special card, which really should get renamed to the Uno Reverse card, because when you play this, you will swap the power of the highest and lowest power units on the battlefield. So if your opponent has a huge unit, like Vi, or Kolgrim, or Archgriffin, or Regis, and you have a really weak unit, then those units swap power, giving you a huge point swing. So in that way, this reminds me a lot of Yrden, though obviously in Yrden's case, that only works when your opponent is boosting a lot. But in this case, it's fine if your opponent has a lot of base power, as long as you make sure that you're the one that has the lowest unit. So in that case, the closest comparison may actually be Ivar Evil Eye, just that Ornate CENSER will have both a higher upside and a higher downside. Because with Ivar, you're always giving your opponent 4 power, whereas for Ornate CENSER, you may be setting their units to 3, 2, or even 1 power. But if it goes wrong, Ornate CENSER may be worth negative points. One other way you could potentially use this would be if you have both the highest and the lowest power card on the board, there may be some Skellige self-damage synergies that you could use, with cards like Olaf, Heim, maybe even Melusine and Ceres Fearless. Then there's Ring of Favor, which is an 8 provision cost special card, which always starts in your hand, and at the beginning of the round will boost an allied unit by 4, which is terrible value. However, at the end of your turn, the power of that boost increases by 2. So that means the longer you wait to play it, the stronger it becomes. However, if you wait too long and your opponent passes before you play it, then Ring of Favor will get banished, you'll draw a card and basically replace it with whatever's at the top of your deck. So that means you must play it in round 1, otherwise it gets banished and replaced by a different card. So it's all about predicting how long you think round 1 is going to go, and playing it right at the end of the round to maximize the value. So it takes good game feel to play this correctly, otherwise you could get burned. And technically you can increase its power by increasing the duration of the round with cards like Mata. Maybe in the most edge cases of scenarios, maybe in the most niche of scenarios, it could be worth deliberately either mulliganing this card back into your deck so that it gets banished, or not playing it in round 1 so that it gets banished, as a form of thinning. However, at 8 provisions, that is a very expensive way to do that, especially since it doesn't directly give you any value in that case. So that seems pretty unlikely, unless maybe that's a sneaky way to get slightly more Kolgrim value, but still, I kinda doubt it. Also worth noting, if you do get this card powered up a lot, it could be a great addition to dual casting decks. Then there's the Rune Mage, which is a 4 power, 10 provision cost human mage, which on deploy for the rest of the game, anytime you use a create card, rather than showing you 3 options, you get 5 options to choose from. You also create and play a Runestone, which is the alchemy card that each faction has, giving them 3 random bronze cards from their faction to choose from. Though in this case, now you get to choose between 5 cards. So first thing that comes to mind with this unit is that it procs Nilfgaard Assimilate at least twice, making it kind of similar to a Brothin's, although Brothin's is a Nilfgaard Assimilate engine himself, whereas Rune Mage does not have that additional direct point value, but does give you a little bit of quality of life with the additional create options. Outside of Assimilate decks, you're probably not getting enough points out of the provision cost to justify including this, unless you really care about that quality of life improvement, but even that is something that is most significant for Nilfgaard Assimilate, setting up Aguara True Form and Uma's Curse, among other Assimilate proccing cards. The one exception to that potentially being the Power Shift seasonal event, in which this will be much stronger. Then we have Mysterious Puzzle Box, which is a 5 provision cost artifact. It's disloyal, so you play it on your opponent's side of the board, and on deploy you spawn a 7 power gin on the opposite row, which, again, because you're playing the box on your opponent's row, opposite side means you're giving yourself that 7 power gin, and choosing a card from your opponent's hand. But then, I must admit, I just do not get this order ability, because this would be your opponent that's using this, so they're the ones choosing to transform a card, even though you were the one that initially selected a card, so you lost me. The card that something is getting transformed into is a 13 power unit, so in theory, that is strong. But let me know in the comments how you think this card is going to work, because I just don't get it. And if you wait until Adrenaline 2, then you're just getting that 7 power gin and nothing else. Next is Arcane Tome, which is a 6 provision cost artifact card with a Zeal order to play a special card from our deck, but then it will get moved from our side of the board to our opponent's side of the board, unless our opponent doesn't have any space for it, in which case it will get destroyed. And since it has a cooldown of 1, that means once it goes to our opponent's side of the board, they'll be able to use it soon thereafter. And at the end of the turn, if it's not on cooldown, it will get destroyed, which means if you leave it on the board and don't use it, then it will destroy itself. Otherwise, it will keep getting passed back and forth between you and your opponent. So at 6 provisions, it is a very cheap tutor, but at the expense of giving your opponent a tutor as well. However, if you're on red coin and you play it at the end of round 1, when your opponent has already passed, then that means your opponent is not going to benefit from it at all, so you're just getting a really cheap tutor. Or if you deliberately play it opposite one of your opponent's rows that is completely full, then that will also prevent your opponent from getting it. Outside of outright denying your opponent the chance to use this card, you could use it in a very special heavy deck to give yourself a cheap tutor, and although your opponent will get it as well, you rely on getting more value out of it than your opponent because your deck is built around specials. Then we have a big one with Erendite, a card that I've long wanted added to the game. It's a 9 provision cost special card. Kinda strange that we get all these artifacts in this expansion, and yet this sword is a special, not an artifact. But it has Echo, which means after we play it, we'll get another copy of it at the start of the next round, and then boost the lowest powered ally unit by the amount of excess damage dealt, which obviously means, at least initially, it's doing nothing. However, at the end of your turn, if you have more points than your opponent, then it will increase the damage by 1, no matter if Erendite is in your hand, deck, or graveyard. So this is another creative way in which you can get some carryover value by powering up Erendite in round 1 and round 2, playing it for the first time ideally at the end of round 1 or the end of round 2, and then getting the echoed copy for a future round, and then ideally playing Erendite at the end of round 3 when you've given it as much time as possible to power up. I think it will be best on blue coin because it checks to see who has more points at the end of your turn. So if you're going first, then you're basically guaranteed to get this to proc at the end of your first turn. And then for the rest of round 1, it's always going to check after you have played one more card than your opponent, making it that much easier to meet the criteria. It may also work well in high-paced decks that can quickly slam down a bunch of points at the start of the round to make sure that you at least get a few procs before your opponent starts setting up all of their combos. Because of course, if you don't have more points than your opponent, then Erendite could be a real dud. But maybe that means you play really aggressively in round 1, playing your first round of Erendite at the end of the round, and maybe even push hard in round 2 and play Erendite at the end of round 2, which, if you've had enough time to set it up, could give you a lot of tempo, either forcing your opponent to play additional cards to catch up, or just take the 2-0 win. Then last but certainly not least, we have the Golden NEKKER, which is a 9 provision cost special card, and on deploy, if we do not have any cards that cost 10 or more provisions in our starting deck, then we play our top unit, special, and artifact card from our deck. That is 3 cards on 1 turn, which is insane value. However, the real cost of this card is not its 9 provisions. Of course, the real cost of this card is not 9 provisions, it's that you can't exceed 9 provisions with any other card in your deck. If that condition looks familiar, it should, because there's one other card that has that, and that is Ciri Nova, who's an 8 power unit that gets Shield, Veil, and most importantly, Resilience when you play her if you do not have any cards that cost 10 or more provisions. That card does see some play in some seasonal events, but outside of that, I think is rarely ever used because of course that means you're missing out on what would normally be the best cards in your deck. So that is definitely still a major handicap for the rest of your deck. However, if you combine Ciri with Golden NEKKER, is that suddenly enough value to warrant the sacrifice? Because if you do use them, you're not going to have any of those really big cards, but that probably means you're going to have a ton of mid-range cards. I think that's going to scare a lot of people away, or people just flat out won't know how to make a deck like that. So for that reason, I think Golden NEKKER will be quite uncommon outside of a few people testing it out when it first gets released. But maybe, just maybe, those who are willing to completely redesign their decks may have a new secret weapon. So there's a look at all the cards coming out for the new Forgotten Treasures expansion. I'm really excited about how new and different these cards feel, with lots of unique ways to get carryover, and a surprising number of cards with value that varies a lot depending on whether you're on blue coin or red coin. In total, it will cost you 280 scraps if you want to get both cards from a given faction, 4,200 scraps to get all of the neutral cards, and 5,880 scraps to get absolutely everything. Let me know which cards and which factions you're most excited to play, as well as any clever synergies that you have planned. Because discovering new synergies is always my favorite thing about new cards, and I'm sure there are a bunch out there that I haven't even thought of. If you liked the video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button so that you don't miss out when we try out a bunch of new decks with these new cards, generally in seasonal events. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.